A baby is born on Maryland's eastern shore. He doesn't know his exact birth date. He barely knows his mother. He'll never know his father. The world expects him to live and die as property, another number in a slaveholder's ledger. His name is Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. 77 years later, that same man will dine with presidents, advise Abraham Lincoln on civil rights, serve as U.S. ambassador to Haiti, write 3 best-selling autobiographies, and become the most photographed American of the 19th century, more than even Abraham Lincoln himself. This is the story of Frederick Douglass, but not the sanitized version you learned in school. This is the real story. The escapes that failed, the beatings that broke him, the women who saved him, the controversies that followed him, and the impossible journey from slave to the most powerful black voice in America. The child who knew nothing, Frederick Douglass would later write, "I have no accurate knowledge of my age, never having seen any authentic record containing it." Think about that. He didn't even know when he was born. This was deliberate. Slaveholders systematically separated enslaved children from their parents, erasing their identities from day one. Frederick's mother, Harriet Bailey, worked on a plantation 12 miles away. He saw her only a handful of times in his entire childhood, always at night, always in secret. She would walk those 12 miles after a full day of forced labor just to lie down beside her son for a few hours. Then she'd walk back before dawn to avoid the whip. He wrote, "She would lie down with me and get me to sleep, but long before I waked she was gone." When Frederick was 7 years old, his mother died. He learned about it the way you might hear about a stranger's death, as a distant fact with no ceremony, no funeral, no mourning allowed. His father? Whispered to be the white plantation owner who enslaved him. Frederick would spend his entire life searching for his father's name and never finding it. At 6 years old, he was torn from his grandmother's arms and taken to Y House Plantation, where he slept on a dirt floor in a hovel. In winter, he'd crawl into a meal bag head first, leaving his feet in the ashes to keep warm. He'd steal raw corn from the crib and roast it over fire to stop the hunger pains. He later said, "I have often been so pinched with hunger that I have fought with the dog for the smallest crumbs." This was Frederick Douglass's childhood, and this is the part they don't teach you, the brutal specifics of what slavery actually meant. The moment everything changed at age 8, Frederick was sent to Baltimore to work for Hugh and Sophia Auld, and this is where his life took an unexpected turn. Sophia Auld did something radical. She started teaching Frederick the alphabet. For a brief moment, this enslaved child experienced something revolutionary. A white woman treating him like a human being, teaching him to read. Then her husband found out. Hugh Auld exploded in rage. Learning will spoil the best nigger in the world. If he learns to read, he'll want to know how to write. And this accomplished, he'll be running away with himself. Frederick Douglass later called this the most important moment of his life, because Hugh Auld had just revealed the secret: knowledge unfits a child to be a slave. From that moment, I understood the pathway from slavery to freedom. Sophia stopped teaching him. She hid all books, even her Bible, from Frederick. But it was too late. The seed was planted. Frederick taught himself to read by bribing poor white children with bread. He'd carry Webster's spelling book in his pocket and study writings on cellar doors and barn walls. When he was 12, he bought a book called The Columbian Orator with money he'd saved. It was a collection of speeches about natural rights and freedom. That book, Douglass would later say, gave him the language to understand what had been stolen from him. Here's what breaks your heart. Frederick later learned that his mother, who he barely knew, had also been literate. One of the few enslaved people in that region who could read. He wrote, "I am quite willing to attribute any love of letters I possess, not to my Anglo-Saxon paternity, but to the native genius of my sable, unprotected, and uncultivated mother." The slave breaker who couldn't break him at age 15, Frederick was sent back to rural Maryland to work as a field hand. He started secretly teaching other enslaved people to read on Sundays, sometimes more than 30 men gathering in an illegal school. When his enslaver found out, he was furious. Frederick was hired out to Edward Covey, a man with a reputation as a slave breaker, someone who specialized in crushing the spirit of rebellious slaves. Covey whipped Frederick so frequently that his wounds never had time to heal. The beatings broke his body. They broke his soul. They broke his spirit. Douglass would later write, "I was broken in body, soul, and spirit. My natural elasticity was crushed, my intellect languished, the disposition to read departed. I was transformed into a brute." But then something shifted. At 16 years old, Frederick Douglass fought back. One day, when Covey tried to tie him up for another beating, Frederick grabbed him and fought him for nearly 2 hours. Covey never touched him again. Douglass wrote, "You have seen how a man was made a slave. You shall see how a slave was made a man." The woman who bought his freedom. Twice in 1837, Frederick met Anna Murray, a free black woman in Baltimore 5 years older than him. She worked as a domestic servant and had saved money, real money, her own money. When Frederick planned his escape, Anna gave him her life savings to buy a train ticket. She gave him a sailor's uniform to disguise himself. She risked her own safety. If caught helping a fugitive slave, she could be arrested, beaten, sold south herself. On September 3, 1838, dressed as a sailor with forged identification papers from a free black seaman, Frederick boarded a train in Baltimore. The entire journey, Baltimore to Havre de Grace by rail, steam ferry across the Susquehanna River, train to Wilmington, steamboat to Philadelphia, and finally to New York City, took less than 24 hours. Frederick Douglass later described arriving in New York, "I felt as one might feel upon escape from a den of hungry lions. I lived more in one day than in a year of my slave life." 11 days after reaching New York, Frederick and Anna were married. They adopted the surname Douglass after the Scottish clan in Walter Scott's poem, Lady of the Lake. Together, they would have 5 children, Rosetta, Louis, Frederick Jr., Charles, and Annie. Anna Murray Douglass doesn't get nearly enough credit in history. She funded his escape. She supported his abolitionist career. She ran their home while he traveled the world giving speeches. For 44 years, she was his anchor. When she died in 1882, he was devastated. The book that changed everything and nearly got him killed, Frederick began speaking at abolitionist meetings in Massachusetts. He was a natural orator. His voice could command a room. But some people didn't believe his story. "You were never a slave," they'd say. "You're too articulate, too educated." So in 1845, he did something incredibly dangerous. He published Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. He named names. He named places. He provided every specific detail of his enslavement. The book became an instant bestseller. It was also a wanted poster. By publishing his real story, Douglass had just told every slave catcher in America exactly where to find him and who owned him legally. Frederick had to flee to England. For 2 years, he toured Britain and Ireland, giving speeches and selling his book. British abolitionists loved him. And here's the twist. They bought his freedom. They paid his former enslaver $711.66. The price of Frederick Douglass's legal freedom. Think about that irony. The man who escaped slavery, who fought for his own freedom, ultimately had to be purchased. The newspaper that lit the North Star in 1847, back in America and legally free, Douglass moved his family to Rochester, New York. There, he did something radical. He started his own newspaper, the North Star, named after Polaris, the star that guided enslaved people to freedom. The motto printed on every issue, "Right is of no sex, truth is of no color, God is the Father of us all, and we are all brethren." Through the North Star, Douglass promoted abolition, women's rights, and black civil rights. He broke with his former mentor, William Lloyd Garrison, who believed in moral persuasion only. Douglass began to advocate for political action, and if necessary, armed resistance. He became friends with John Brown, the radical abolitionist. When John Brown planned the raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859, he wanted Douglass to join him. Douglass refused, calling it a suicide mission. He was right. Brown was captured and hanged. Douglass had to flee to Canada to avoid arrest as a co-conspirator. The war that gave him a meeting with Lincoln when the Civil War began in 1861, Frederick Douglass had one message: this war must be about ending slavery, and black men must be allowed to fight for their own freedom. At first, Lincoln resisted, but Douglass kept pushing. He recruited black soldiers, including two of his own sons, Lewis and Charles, who served in the famous 54th Massachusetts Infantry. But black soldiers faced discrimination. They were paid less than white soldiers. They received inferior equipment. They were often assigned to manual labor instead of combat. In August 1863, Frederick Douglass walked into the White House and met with President Abraham Lincoln. He demanded equal pay and equal treatment for black soldiers. Lincoln listened. Changes began. Douglass met with Lincoln multiple times during the war. At Lincoln's second inauguration in 1865, Douglass attended the reception. When White House guards tried to stop him at the door, Lincoln saw him and called out, "Here comes my friend Douglass." He invited him inside and asked, "What did you think of my inaugural address?" They talked for nearly an hour. This is the moment the impossible became real. A man born enslaved, talking as an equal with the President of the United States. The marriage that scandalized America after Anna died in 1882, Douglass's life took another controversial turn. In 1884, at age 66, he married Helen Pitts, a white feminist and abolitionist, 20 years younger than him. The reaction was explosive. Many in her white family stopped speaking to her. His black children felt betrayed, viewing it as a repudiation of their mother. But Frederick Douglass didn't care. When critics attacked him, he said, "My first wife was the color of my mother. My second wife is the color of my father." That one line silenced much of the criticism. He was reminding America that he existed because of interracial relationships. Not consensual ones, but ones forced by the violence of slavery. Helen and Frederick traveled to England, France, Italy, Greece, and Egypt. They lived openly as an interracial couple in a country that had just ended slavery 20 years earlier. They refused to hide. The statesman who wouldn't stay silent even after slavery ended, Frederick Douglass, never stopped fighting. He held multiple federal positions: U.S. Marshal for Washington, D.C., 1877 to 1881, Recorder of Deeds for Washington, D.C., 1881 to 1886, U.S. Minister to Haiti, 1889 to 1891. He was the first black person to hold each of these positions. But even with these honors, Douglass watched as the gains of Reconstruction were stripped away. Jim Crow laws spread across the South, lynchings increased, black voting rights were destroyed through violence and fraud. In his speeches during the 1880s and 1890s, Douglass became more radical, not less. He denounced the Supreme Court for gutting the 14th and 15th Amendments. He called out the government for abandoning black citizens. He demanded federal action to stop lynching. On February 20th, 1895, Douglass attended a meeting of the National Council of Women in Washington. He returned home to his estate, Cedar Hill, in the afternoon. He was preparing to give a speech at a local church when he collapsed from a massive heart attack. He was 77 years old. His funeral was attended by thousands. Flags across Washington flew at half-mast, but many white newspapers barely mentioned it. The legacy they try to sanitize. Here's what most history books won't tell you about Frederick Douglass. He wasn't perfect. He had complicated relationships with women. Journalist Ottilie Assing was deeply in love with him and likely his lover for years. She committed suicide in 1884 when he married Helen Pitts. He fought bitterly with other abolitionists over tactics and strategy. His relationship with women's rights leaders like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton nearly broke in 1869 when he supported the 15th Amendment, giving black men the vote, even though it excluded women. He was criticized by some black activists for being too moderate, for working with white institutions, for not advocating armed revolution. And yet, Frederick Douglass taught himself to read when it was a crime. He escaped slavery by his own cunning. He became the most famous black man in America. He advised presidents. He refused to be silenced his entire life. He wrote 3 best-selling autobiographies. He gave thousands of speeches. He was photographed more than 160 times, more than any other American of the 19th century. He knew that images mattered, that representation mattered. Every photograph of Frederick Douglass shows him looking directly at the camera. No smile, no submissive pose, just dignity, just power, just a man who refused to be anything less than fully human. This is why his story matters. Frederick Douglass's life proves something that terrified slaveholders. Enslaved people were not inferior. They were systematically denied education, brutally oppressed, and violently subjugated. But they were not inferior. Given the chance, they could teach themselves. They could write best-selling books. They could advise presidents. They could become diplomats. They could shape the conscience of a nation. Every time Frederick Douglass gave a speech, he was a living refutation of every racist lie ever told. That's why they tried so hard to silence him. That's why they beat him. That's why they forced him to flee to England. That's why they tried to dismiss him as an exception. But he wasn't an exception. He was proof of what millions of enslaved people could have become if given the chance. On his gravestone in Mount Hope Cemetery in Rochester, New York, there's no long inscription, just his name, just his dates, nothing else needed. Because Frederick Douglass's life speaks for itself. From slave to statesman, from property to presidential advisor, from a child who didn't know his own birthday to a man whose words would echo for centuries. This is the Frederick Douglass story they don't tell you. Not the mythology, not the sanitized version, the real story, the documented facts, the impossible journey that actually happened. And here's what it proves. Freedom is not given, it's taken. Knowledge is power. And one voice, one relentless, unyielding, brilliant voice can change the world. Frederick Douglass lived that truth, and we're still living in the world he helped to create.